This is a 46 of 46 podcast campfire story. In the twilight hours, as the sun starts to dip behind the mountains and its golden light kisses the surrounding summits, the darkness engulfs the valleys below. The sounds of the forest awaken as the moon rises, and a wailing can be heard for miles. A distinctive wailing that to some may just sound like the wind in the trees, but it's something much more. Something sinister. And this is the time of day where it's best to be at your campsite surrounded by the safety of others, instead of alone on the trail. Deep in the wilderness, so far into the backcountry that no one could hear you scream. You're walking down the dark trail, unaware of what's following you just beyond the shadow of your headlamp. And then you hear a rumble in the brush only to turn around and see nothing. Swearing you heard footsteps lurking behind you, but the only tracks in the mud are your own. That is how you know he's there. Watching you, stalking you, waiting for the right moment to pounce. The hunt is on and you're the prey. In these situations, it's best to keep walking, for while he may not be fast, he's persistent, cunning, patiently waiting for the time to attack a fatigued and unsuspecting hiker. But don't be fooled. There's a lot of false trails on these mountains. Taking the wrong path could be the start of a never-ending maze designed to wear out a weary traveler, such as yourself. For Peter, straying away from the group was only his first mistake. Being unfamiliar with what stalked this rugged wilderness was the next. But sometimes all it takes is one wrong step down one wrong path to find yourself face to face with the Nye Wolf. It was the summer of 1999 in the Adirondack Mountains. Hikers were climbing mountains big and small. Paddlers were paddling the thousands of lakes and streams throughout the park. After all, summertime in the largest wilderness area in the continental United States is bound to bring lots of travelers seeking both solitude and adventure in the great outdoors. From the most experienced of hikers, climbers, and paddlers, to people experiencing nature's embrace in that fresh mountain air for the first time. Whoever they were, and whatever their reason for visiting the ADK was, they all had something in common. They wanted to see some mountains. Since the Adirondack Park has hundreds and hundreds of them, some with trails and some without, the choices were endless. The 46 high peaks, however, were the main attraction, and they had been for some time. Climbing all 46 high peaks to become an official 46er was a lifetime-sized goal that many outdoors men and women sought to achieve. And many of these high peaks had official trails to the summits, maintained by the DEC, and many of them did not. These trailless peaks, however, were often the scene of search and rescues, as hikers found themselves lost, trying to climb to the summit and unable to make their way back out of the woods. So the DEC and the 46ers organization decided to work together to establish single paths to the summits of these trailless peaks, known as herd paths. These trails had already been established throughout the years from hikers following them to the summit, but they were not maintained, they didn't have trail markers, and they were as rugged as can be. The DEC and 46ers collectively decided to start off with Tabletop Mountain, since it was the shortest trail. And after Tabletop was complete, the two mountains which yielded the highest amount of search and rescues in the high peaks were up next, Street and Nye. Two rugged and confusing peaks thanks to the abundance of trails going in every which direction. Some even dead-ending or looping back in an endless series of circles. Without a compass, map, and extensive backcountry experience, it was nearly impossible to successfully navigate to either summit. Four-way intersections with nothing signaling the proper route resulted in lost hiker after lost hiker. And some were rescued, Others, however, were not so lucky. There was something different about these two peaks. They seemed to swallow hikers alive, never to be seen from again. Sometimes, nothing but their boots and backpacks would be found on the trail, with no other sign of the missing hiker. It was the middle of July as Peter and his small trail crew set out to establish one correct route to the summit of both of these high peaks. They navigated to the summits via a map, a compass, and a prayer. So they worked their way up the mountains, closing off the many false paths to create one correct path to the summits, laying branches across the incorrect routes while also eliminating the abundance of blowdown across the trail every 20 feet or so. There were many stories and rumors as to how such a large amount of false paths had developed there on both Street and Nye Mountain, but the truth had yet to be revealed to Peter and his gang of burly trail crew, completely unaware of what stalked these woods. It was assumed that the paths were created over time from one lost hiker following the previous lost hiker's tracks in a never-ending cycle, forming the maze that became the trails up Street and Nye. But the woods consisted of an open hardwood forest down low with a thick, rugged spruce forest up top that would eat you alive if you went off trail. The day of trail work was winding down as Peter and the gang began packing up their tools to head back to their campsite on the flanks of Street and Nye. Peter wanted to cover more ground and continue working, however, since there was still another hour of daylight and camp was only half a mile from where they stood. So they parted ways and the crew started back down the mountain, back towards camp, while Peter continued up the trail to the next three-way junction to block off the two false paths. And as Peter moved up the narrow trail, lined with tight spruce trees scratching at his elbows, he hopped over a downed tree across the trail and caught his pants on a branch, ripping them at the pocket. As he continued up the trail, his pants kept catching on all the down branches along the trail, ripping his pants more and more with every step. Unaware, Peter's knife fell from his ripped pocket as he climbed up and over a boulder just before arriving at the three-way junction. And upon arriving at this junction, the wind began wailing with a light whistle to it as the trees swayed from side to side all around the forest. This three-way trail split consisted of three moderately used herd paths, all of which looked like the correct choice. Peter was certain the trail on the right was the correct path, but in an effort to be sure, mixed with a general curiosity, he decided to audition the path on the left just to be sure. Since all three trails met up at this junction and each went in completely different directions. A mere minutes later, as Peter climbed up this blow-down-ridden, narrow, muddy path, the trail wound around and circled back down the mountain towards the three-way junction. Clearly the wrong trail. And Peter did as he was doing and grabbed some large branches and nearby blowdown to block off the entrance to the left trail. And as he laid the final branch across the left trail, Peter was startled when something sped across the path only a few feet behind him. He jumped and quickly turned around only to see nothing. And then he heard rustling in the bush off to the right. The wailing wind started to pick up again as he stared intently around the forest, wondering what animal was with him in the woods, and expecting to see a rabbit or maybe even a deer. But he saw nothing. Sunset was still another 40 minutes off, so Peter grabbed his flashlight and decided to check out where the middle trail went to, since he knew the trail on the right was the correct path. And Peter thought to himself, well, I'm about to block off this trail, so I might as well see where it leads first. So up the center path he went, just to explore and have some fun. And minutes later, as Peter stopped for a drink, he heard what sounded like an animal walking up behind him on the trail. But as he turned around to look, there was nothing there. And no tracks in the mud but his own. That was strange, he said out loud to himself, but quickly shook it off and continued traveling northwest up the path for roughly a quarter mile before it came to a quick and abrupt dead end, directly in front of a 12-foot boulder covered in green moss. This confirmed in his brain it was indeed a false path, and his instincts at the three-way junction were correct. As Peter turned and prepared to head back down the trail, he noticed something peculiar, about 15 feet to the left of the boulder in the thick spruce forest. He saw 4 different backpacks lined up on the ground, 2 black and 2 red, along with 4 pairs of boots, each sitting directly in front of the 4 packs, one by one. 3 of these backpacks looked like they had been there for many years. Full-frame packs, partially covered in moss and leaves, and weathered. But one of these packs was modern, red with a black zipper, and looked seemingly new and untouched. What were these doing here, Peter thought to himself. The wind was wailing as the trees blew around the woods, and these backpacks and boots were just out of place. There was something weird about them. Knowing about the abundance of search and rescues on this mountain, along with the long list of hikers who have disappeared completely in these woods, Peter couldn't help but question what happened up here. The sun continued to set as magic hour lit up the green spruce canopy while the wind howled. But only a few feet after he started to walk away from these bizarre backpacks, he once again heard a loud rustle in the trees coming from the opposite side of the trail. And it was time for Peter to head back to camp to tell the crew about these strange backpacks and boots. He walked down the path at a moderate pace while something lurked behind him. Peter couldn't shake the sound of footsteps following him, but every time he turned around, he saw nothing. Then as he continued walking, the footsteps began again. Quickly, he arrived back at the 3-way junction, less than a mile from his crew and their camp down the mountain. The sun was minutes away from setting now as the forest grew darker and the crescent moon lit up the clear, star-filled Adirondack sky. After arriving at the junction, knowing the trail was a dead end, and exhausted after a long day of trail work, Peter quickly grabbed more brush from around the woods and closed off this dead-end trail to nowhere in the center with one final 6-foot-long tree limb covered in green leaves. The false path on the left and the false path in the center were finally closed off. The day's work was over. It was time to head back to camp and meet his trail crew for dinner. As he prepared to leave the trail junction, Peter grabbed his flashlight and flipped on the light, and then he heard the same footsteps approaching him from behind. The same steps he'd been hearing all day. Only this time, they were accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Peter's eyes widened, knowing a large predator was directly behind him in the woods. He slowly and cautiously turned around. Nervously, he shined his flashlight up the trail towards the sound, and he found himself standing eye to eye with the Nye Wolf. The beast growled viciously, its black fur camouflaged against the darkness surrounding the forest. The light reflected off its sharp white teeth, and a glow from its single purple eye lit up the woods as he locked in on Peter. This was no ordinary wolf. Slowly and steadily, the creature inched closer and closer as it growled and snarled. Peter found himself trapped. The handsaw he brought with him was on the ground to the left of the wolf, and all he could think to do was to grab his knife. So he slowly reached into his back pocket, only to realize it had fallen out of his ripped pants somewhere along the trail. As Peter began to process his inability to protect himself, the black-furred wolf suddenly stopped and started to back away towards the darkness. The wolf's single glowing purple eye never looked away from Peter, and as it neared the edge of the shadow of Peter's flashlight, it suddenly disappeared into thin air. Vanished. Frightened yet also unsure of what he just witnessed, Peter let out a sigh of relief as the wolf left. And the woods grew deathly silent for a moment. Peter's heart, however, was beating a mile a minute. He took another deep breath to calm his nerves. The wind continued to blow, and as Peter gathered himself to continue back down the trail, he was once again met with the sound of that low, guttural growl. Only this time, it was louder and directly behind him. Before Peter could turn around, the wolf leapt from the darkness and attacked. It sunk his sharp canine teeth into the back of Peter's leg, just below the knee, mercilessly attacking. Peter reached for the handsaw that was just out of his grasp. The wolf continued clamping down his sharp teeth into Peter's leg. Blood ran down his limb while Peter began to fight him off with nearby sticks and his bare hands. Peter then grabbed the beast by the head, and with a strange amount of ease was able to pull his jaws open to release his bloodied leg, before he threw the attacking wolf off the trail.